Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our August webinar. Just please raise your hands if you can hear me, just to make sure that everything works well. Perfect. Thank you. So our topic for this evening, the one that you selected last month, is neuroplasticity and hair pulling. The poll for this month's topic is, or rather for September, is active, so you can vote if you didn't already. And then once I'm done with my part of the lecture, and before we get to the Q&A, I will end the poll and tell you what the topic will be in September. So I have to say, when I saw the topic that you chose, I was initially quite happy because I like neuroplasticity research and obviously, anything related to hair pulling as well. But then as I started kind of digging deeper, I realized that there's exactly zero research that actually combines these two things. So what I decided to do is explain what well, let me move to the next slide that will outline this a little bit better. So what I in the end decided to do was to obviously explain what neuroplasticity is, tell you what you can do to promote neuroplasticity, and then tell you a little bit about the connections between habit formation and neuroplasticity, because obviously hair pulling is not reducible to merely a habit, but the habitual part of hair pulling is extremely important. And in fact, in certain types of treatment, that's basically the only thing that's being addressed. So there's a connection there. And then I will try to explain how you can apply these strategies specifically to hair pulling. So hopefully I will be able to give you some down-to-earth and practical information, and also help you set proper expectations for change. Because I think even outside of the topic of neuroplasticity, this is a very important topic, because very often it's your expectations that sort of determine the outcome, in forms of self-fulfilling prophecies. So that's more or less what I will be talking about. And I will present a few studies as well that have to do with mindfulness and neuroplasticity. They will hopefully illustrate these principles and show that there's real science behind them. And then you will see why is it that I chose these specific studies. Hopefully by the time we get to them, it will be clear. As always, as I'm talking, you can ask any questions that you may have about the content of the webinar, or anything else you'd like to know. And then once I'm done, I will answer all your questions. So let's start by defining what neuroplasticity is. That's, with me, always the starting point. We have to know what we're talking about. So the simplest, most down-to-earth definition that I found is this one. So neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to adapt based on new experiences. So it's how your brain changes in response to what you do in the world and what the world does to you. The reason why I chose this very basic definition is that when I was sort of looking at all kinds of studies that have to do with neuroplasticity, everything was fine. But then I decided to look for these kind of popular science articles to see if there's something useful there. And then one thing leads to another, and you go to Reddit, and then basically it's just downhill from there. So I saw some quite outlandish claims in terms of what you can achieve with neuroplasticity. So I thought it was very important to show that this is not some high-flying, like once people start connecting neuroplasticity to, like paranormal stuff and quantum physics, that you've gone too far. So it's a very down-to-earth and very practical thing. And I hope this is one of your takeaways, that even though it sounds abstract, what you actually do to promote neuroplasticity and to make changes in your brains is down-to-earth to the point of being banal. So it's a topic that's been talked about more lately in the past decade or so, but it's not exactly a very new idea. Although looking at science textbooks, you would think that it's really just cutting edge new concept in science. As I was doing research for this, I was quite surprised how old these ideas are. For example, even when I was in medical school, which wasn't exactly 100 years ago, we were taught that basically brain tissue is so highly differentiated and sophisticated that it doesn't regenerate. You cannot create new nerve cells. What you can do is just lose them. And then as you get older, you have less and less of them. But there is no way to change the way that your brain is structured. Basically, it's, you have the material that you're given at birth, and then good luck with that. So that wasn't that long ago. And then, and as I was sort of digging back into history, I realized that the idea that the brain is plastic, as well as the idea that it's not, are equally old. So I found some studies done by an Italian, we can't say neuroscientists because this was in somewhere in the 18th century, so it's very old, where he trained mice to do, or rats, to do specific tasks and to repeat them very frequently. And then he would kill them, and then also kill mice that weren't trained to do these tasks. And then he would compare their brains. And then what he realized, even back then, is that the brain structure actually differed, and that certain regions involved in these activities that he would make them do would be more pronounced or thicker in those mice that he trained versus those that he didn't. Basically, that is neuroplasticity. Their brains altered because of the specific experience that they had. So that was long ago. So then even the founder of modern neuroscience, Ramon y Cajal, even he talked about neuroplasticity, although he didn't quite mean the same thing as we mean now. My favorite example is William James. So in his Principles of Psychology, which was published somewhere in the early 20th century, he talked about neuroplasticity, and actually he said that brain is extraordinarily plastic. So not even, there's evidence it could be possible. For William James, this was like a fact. It's just, that's what it is. And when he says plastic, he meant malleable. It means that brain the brain tissue is very active and very easy to reshape. But this claim wasn't really taken that seriously, in fact, until recently. And it's only in recent papers that you find references to this simple statement by William James. The reason why I find that very interesting is because William James is one of those sort of towering intellectual figures, I think maybe more in philosophy than he is in psychology, but in psychology, today he's still quoted from time to time and well respected. I find it very interesting considering that, another guy who lived at the same time, Freud, is vilified, every chance psychiatrists or neuroscientists get, they will kind of make these little jabs at Freud, whereas William James is still respected. And I think I find that very interesting, and I'm sorry for this digression. I promise I will go back to neuroplasticity. I just can't help myself. I think if they actually took the time to thoroughly read Freud, they would much prefer Freud to William James. But William James and his ideas, they kind of pick and choose. So for a long time, this was ignored because it was not considered scientific, but other aspects of his work were embraced. But he has a lot of, as many wonderful and great ideas that he has, he also has some quite out there ideas. This was considered one. So now that it's not considered an kind of out there idea, he's being quoted as one of the first people who actually kind of noticed this and had this idea. But he also, for example, has a book on psychic mediums because he was really obsessed with paranormal research, and he used to spend a lot of his money. Both he and his brother were very privileged, so work was basically a hobby for them. So he would spend a lot of money going to different psychic mediums, and then pardon me, and then he would test them, and he has this whole book of essays on that. That's another part of William James's thought that science sort of doesn't take very seriously. If you're interested in learning about James's ideas that don't deal directly with neuroplasticity, but I think can be very informative, and you'll see how the idea naturally arises, I strongly advise that you either read Essays in Radical Empiricism which is one of the most easily read works of pragmatic philosophy. It's really outstanding. Or The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is a kind of psychological / philosophical investigation of religious beliefs and experiences. It's really fascinating. So he believed that the brain is very plastic. And in many ways, like if you think about, and if you know his ideas and his psychology, you'll see that it's kind of integral in there. Then later on, after William James, in the 20s, in the 30s, late 40s, 60s, from time to time, studies would appear that would show that brain has some degree of plasticity. So there was evidence even before the last decade or so. In fact, some of the most respected neuroscientists have published papers that have to do with this. A lot of these would be either on experimental animals like monkeys or rats. Some were on humans and had to do with how people recover from brain injuries or conditions like stroke, for example. So if you've ever met or known someone who had a stroke and then they largely recovered, that is the direct result of neuroplasticity, because their brain was able to reorganize itself so that it works as it did, or as close as possible to how it was before. And I'm sometimes surprised that there was like decades and decades of research and theory and, well, just seeing people in plain sight, and yet it somehow was never really a paradigm in science until fairly recently. It's almost like sometimes science has these assumptions that basically shape what scientists can or cannot see. It's very interesting. And then mindfulness research is something that really puts neuroplasticity in the spotlight, at least for the general public, because the studies that were done were really quite fascinating. And the results are, I don't know, to me, like if I believed in magic, that's about as close as you can get. And also mindfulness is really convenient for these studies because it's something that you can teach people very easily, and then you can follow what they do and how they do it, and then see what happens in their brains. So there's one reason why this wasn't a mainstream idea until recently is this: it simply wasn't a part of what scientists agreed on previously. And there wasn't enough evidence to sort of shake that belief. And then the second is that simply we didn't really have the technology to study neuroplasticity. Because if you want to see how brain changes, you need to have imaging technology, which people didn't have until a few decades ago. And you can't go around dissecting living human beings and their brains. So that was out of the question for a very long time. There was one aspect of neuroplasticity that was known and that's very well researched, and it's something that's called synaptic pruning. It sounds very fancy, but it's not really very complex. So synapses are those connections between neurons, and pruning, well, means pruning, right? So it's a process that normally takes place with everyone. So we all went through this process, and depending on your age, you might be going through the process right now. So when we're born, there's this kind of explosion in how many synapses are formed. Basically, your brain connects itself, like all the parts of the brain are intensely interconnected from birth. And this is both good and bad. It's good because there's so many potential connections that you can make from the very beginning, but it's also quite confusing. Like if you want to have a brain that works well, you need proper channels of communication. So periodically, as we grow up, so from the age of, let's say, 2 up to 16 or 17, sometimes even into the late 20s, what our brain does is it cleans those unnecessary connections. So it reshapes itself in order to make itself more efficient. And what do you think? Like, which parts will remain, and which synapses will remain and which ones will go away? Those that are used regularly will obviously stay, and those that aren't will be removed. So what our brain does is that it remodels itself based on how active certain circuits are, and they are active if they have something to do with how we interact with our environment. Hence the definition of neuroplasticity as being a way for our brains to reshape themselves in response to our experiences. There are some ideas in neuroscience that this process, if it goes wrong at a certain place, or starts too late, or isn't efficient enough, or lasts for too long, or doesn't last long enough, depending on what study you consult, it could be something that contributes to conditions like schizophrenia or even autism. For autism, I don't know that there's too much research, although the hypothesis is there. But for schizophrenia, there is even some research to back this up. So that would be one example of neuroplasticity that is absolutely necessary for our healthy development. So in order for us to grow up and be mentally healthy and functional, neuroplasticity is already sort of necessary. When we talk about neuroplasticity, we talk about two main types: functional and structural. Functional means that brain functions are reorganized within existing brain structures. So you don't grow a new part of the brain. Brain structures don't change their size. You have what you have, but your brain will basically change what certain neurons do. When you have people who've had a stroke, I already had that as an example, so let's just run with it. You essentially lose a part of your brain tissue. And that part of the tissue that you've lost had a job to do, or several jobs, as the case may be. So what our brains do in those situations is that they try to reorganize themselves so that other parts of the brain take on the functions that the lost parts performed previously. So that's an example of functional neuroplasticity. It's essentially when within the existing structure, you create new circuits that do certain jobs. And then there is structural neuroplasticity, which is an observable physical change in your brain in response to certain experiences. I will show you two studies towards the end, and one relates to functional neuroplasticity and the other one to structural, so that you see how it's measured and what these effects actually look like. But for now, just remember that there are two types. When we talk about habits, for example, and hair pulling obviously has this aspect of also being a habit, we talk about functional neuroplasticity. When you repeat something long enough, circuits will be formed that will kind of solidify that habit. That's why habits are so difficult to change, because in a certain way, they are wired into our brains. I hesitate to say hardwired because that sounds very fatalistic, but these functional sort of circuits that are made are incredibly stubborn. So what does it depend on? So whether or not your brain can change, how fast can it change, and so on. So there are some things that we can't really quite influence. Genetics obviously plays a role. To my knowledge, there are no specific, I mean, there might be, I'm just saying to my current knowledge, no one has isolated specific genes without a shadow of a doubt that play a role in this. And no one has shown which variants of these genes are better or, facilitate more neuroplasticity. But it's sort of obvious that genetics has to play a role because this is something that's innate to us. So we don't need to know that when you're born with an ability, we don't really need to know what gene it is. We just know that it obviously is genetic, since everyone has it, all the members of a species. So that's an obvious factor. And then another thing is that younger brains tend to change more easily than older brains. That means that the older you get, the effects of neuroplasticity will be more difficult to create. And then there are certain things that we can change and affect. Those are these lifestyle factors, let's say. I listed 3 here, although there are more, but these 3 seem to be, based on my clinical experience, the most important ones. One would be learning a new skill, because so even if this skill doesn't involve your entire brain, it does sort of keep the mechanisms active. So it can be learning a new language, for example. That would be one example. Or you can go one step further and then learn a language that is not from your language group. So if you're a native English speaker, you might want to try and learn, I don't know, French, for example. Or if you want to be even more radical and challenge your brain even more, you go and learn something that's not even Indo-European, like Japanese or, I don't know, Hungarian, Basque, and so on. So you can basically learn new skills or kind of incorporate new information or learn mechanical skills. This also works equally well. And this will keep your brain malleable and active, because every time you need to memorize new information, this has to be encoded in some way. Every time you learn new concepts, and especially the reason why I used language is because it's a good example, because language is something that involves both the motor side of the brain, and then it involves memory and emotion. It's kind of a comprehensive skill, because you have to speak, you also have to memorize, and then those things that you memorize, words and events, and when you speak, that also involves your limbic system. So basically, ultimately, your entire brain will be active in one way or another. Then rest. I almost didn't put this in my presentation, but last week, there was a number of clients that I had conversations about resting and relaxation with. And then I decided, when I saw a study that showed that sleeping and resting facilitates dendritic neuroplasticity. So dendrites are those smaller extensions of neurons, and they reorganize themselves when you rest and sleep. I thought, well, I have to put this, because in general, the topic of how productive people are and how much they get to do and how much they should do, supposedly. So this is a very common theme in therapy with BFRBs. And then sometimes people will talk about sleeping or resting almost as if it were a sin. Like, how dare I sleep or watch TV or read a book that's not work related? So now you know, it serves a very important function. You're facilitating neuroplasticity. So rest is vitally important. And then there's obviously physical activity. This is because physical activity actually changes brain chemistry. So it will change certain neurotransmitters and how they work. And at the same time, it has to do with learning new skills and repetition. So that also helps your brain kind of create new circuits. So these would be three things that you can all implement in one way or another to facilitate neuroplasticity. So an important rule when it comes to neuroplasticity is that neurons that fire together wire together. This is why we have habits established. And this is why, for example, with hair pulling, there's often not just the kind of cycle of pulling, but there's also a lot of rituals attached to it or around it. Because when things occur together at the same time, so when neurons are activated very often in the same manner, then they all become connected together. You establish connections, and then all of it becomes one process. So let's take a look at how the firing and the wiring and pulling might work together. So step one is that something arises that triggers you. Usually some sort of emotional experience that you find unbearable, right? So first, a trigger happens. Then you recognize that it's something quite intense and very unpleasant. And then you say, okay, I give up, I cannot handle this. And then hair pulling steps in, because it is a way to soothe yourself, or at least distract yourself, so that you can sort of get that energy out without having to process what is it that you wanted to avoid, right? So it does something. And then the kind of soothing, calming, releasing, or gratifying effect comes along. And this validates the action. And once the action is validated, you're more likely to repeat it, because your brain, once it feels once it feels validation, obviously it thinks, okay, so this is good. This is something that we should be doing from now on. When we talk about habits, for example, sometimes people simplify this. I put this in 5 steps for, I don't know, it just seemed a logical way to arrange it. But when we talk about habits, for example, we talk about them having 3 components. There's the trigger, there's the behavior, and then there's the validation. So the validation part is terribly important. Here, I talked about self-soothing or gratification because it is generic enough that most people can in some way relate to this. But what exactly is being validated, or why is it that you need self-soothing, in what particular way of self-soothing, or what kind of gratification? This is very much an individual thing. So when you want to understand why a habit is being maintained, you always have to look at this part. So what is it that's being validated? Because very, 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 very often people will say, well, who cares? It makes no sense. It's completely irrational. It's not logical. And I happen to have this allergy to the word irrational. I absolutely detest it, because in order for a habit to be implemented, it has to be repeated many times over. For you to repeat something many times over, it obviously has to do something for you. I think where the confusion comes from is that people sometimes tend to equalize validation with something that's objectively or rationally good. And that's not how our minds work. So even though on an obvious kind of level, pulling is damaging, it damages your hair, it damages your self-image, it takes away your self-confidence, and so on. If it provides, let's say, a specific important aspect, something like if it satisfies a need like self-soothing, then that is precisely why it's maintained. And in fact, that speaks to the importance of that need, because even though the price is so high, a person is still willing to pay it, because that's how important that resource is. So if you want to replace a habit with another habit, it has to provide a similar degree of gratification. So in psychotherapy, we always explore this aspect. And then we figure out whether it's best to substitute this with one habit, or maybe two habits, or maybe three habits, obviously depending on what the underlying need or needs are. Especially when pulling is present for a very long time, it tends to acquire more different functions that it performs. So it becomes a more complex problem, because our psyche likes to be very, I don't know, sort of economic, I guess would be the word. It will assign as many functions as possible to one type of behavior, because it's simpler when you have these very easy and clear-cut solutions. So that gratification, the validation side of things, is possibly the most important part. It's at least as equally important as the trigger. And this is something that we always like to explore. So how do we approach change based on these ideas of neuroplasticity? So if you remember when I talked about pruning, the synapses that are pruned are those that are not used. So in order to get rid of a pattern of behavior at some point, we first need to stop reinforcing it. That's kind of an obvious one. Then we need to find another pattern that we're going to replace the existing one with. So those can be competing responses if you're doing habit reversal training, but not only. In our program, for example, we introduce many more techniques that you can apply. And sometimes you need a specific combination. Like I said previously, validation is quite complex, so you might need to create two different habits to replace one, for example. And then we need to reinforce these new patterns, right? It sounds simple enough. So don't enforce the old ones, find the new one, and then reinforce that one. But the reinforce the new one part is very, very difficult. And so here's why. Rather, here's what's necessary for reinforcement to happen. First, you have to have a clear intention about what you're doing. And I know that this word has different sort of connotations, but here what I mean is that when you try to implement a new behavior, a replacement habit, as you're doing it, you have to have a very clear idea in your mind, why is it that you're doing it and what is it you're trying to achieve. So you have to have clarity and kind of razor sharp focus. The second one is mindfulness. And here, I don't necessarily mean the meditation. In acceptance and commitment therapy, for example, we often talk about mindfulness, but we talk about mindfulness without meditation. We talk about mindfulness as a kind of awareness. And this is very important because you cannot just go around introducing new patterns of behavior wherever you just feel like it. It have to be very specific in specific contexts. So you have to be aware that you're in the proper context where you can incorporate your new pattern or kind of execute the intention that you set. And then there's the validation part. And here I'm using the same word, but I don't actually mean the same thing. When I talk about validation here, I mean you rewarding yourself for successfully applying a new pattern of behavior. So there's the validation that's kind of inherent in the pattern of behavior, but then there's this additional one where you say good job to yourself every time you actually do it well. What specific way of validation here will work for you really depends on you. So you can, I don't know, like you can sometimes it's enough to smile. Like it's a very simple intervention, but it sends information to your brain that you did something well. You can find ways to reward yourself for days without pulling, or you can find a way to reward by, I don't know, like use a dessert you like, or take a trip, or see a friend, or I don't know, take a few hours off from work, whatever you feel is appropriate validation, but do that. Because that way your brain can connect this new pattern to something very pleasant. And that will tell your brain that this pattern should stay. So you're reinforcing the pattern in that way. What people usually tend to do is just be very hard on themselves when they do pull. Because I don't know, somehow this has to be a cultural thing, but I'm not a sociologist, so I wouldn't be able to answer it properly, or an anthropologist. But somehow people have this idea that if they're very hard on themselves, that will make a behavior go away. So when you pull, you're very likely to start judging yourself, or feeling, or just shaming yourself, or just feeling guilt, or thinking you're hopeless, that there's, no way that you can ever change. And so it's almost like, parents, when parents scare little kids into something, that's almost like the mechanism that I'm talking about. I'm really sorry about the noise. I opened the windows because finally there's like pleasant breeze, and the street was completely silent for most of the day. And yet now when I started the webinar, I feel like people just decided to run around in circles and drive their cars. I hope it's not too disturbing. So what was I saying? So yeah, so people are more likely to judge themselves for when they do something wrong, rather than to reward themselves when they do something good. Being hard on yourself, I'm afraid to say, it really doesn't work. In fact, it makes things even worse, because you feel guilty. That just kind of amounts frustration, which will lead to more pulling in the future. And in terms of the message that your brain gets, it's also not particularly useful. What your brain gets is not this behavior, just no, don't do this again. And that will be all fine and good if that behavior was meaningless. But if you remember, I did tell you that usually there is a need. If it's self-soothing, for example, it's a legitimate human need that we all have. So what you're doing is, by saying not this, you're telling your brain this is not the way to get it, and stop doing this, but you don't actually tell your brain how to satisfy the need that pulling satisfies. And well, you can ignore your needs, but they're not going to go away. In fact, very often they come about through pulling because you're ignoring them already. So that's not the way to go. Judging yourself is like saying, I don't know, like asking me what's the color of my walls, and I tell you, well, I can tell you that it's not purple. It absolutely is not purple. It's just that you still have no idea what the color is. So that's judging yourself. It's saying not this, but it's not saying what is it that you should be doing. But when you specifically validate yourself every time when you successfully do something, when you reinforce the new pattern, then your brain gets it. It says, oh, okay, so that's what they want from me. So this is the direction that we're going in. So validation is what tells your brain this way is good. That's useful information, and it's practical information. So that's the way to go. Then by analysis here, I don't necessarily mean any specific procedure, but as you incorporate new patterns, you have to be very mindful about where they work and where they don't work, and where is it that you actually need them and where you don't need them. And this is why I called it analysis. It sounds very formal, but I didn't know what other word to use. Essentially, you don't pull in every situation. So this is why we do awareness training, so that you can become aware of where, how, and why. And then you can find a good space to kind of fit these new patterns in. In general, whatever behavioral pattern we have, good or bad, they all have a context in which they function well, a context where they're useful. And that obviously means that there are areas of your life where they're not useful. So just to give you like a specific example, if you work in a job where you communicate with people all the time, if it's a formal environment, you will speak in a very particular way. But chances are that as soon as you go home, you will change your speech patterns or word choices, because at work, certain set of patterns works well, but then at home, another set of patterns will work even better. In fact, if you used your work talk to talk to your partner or your children, that would sound a little weird. And the same way that if you talk with your bosses the way you talk with your partner, you might end up being fired, depending on the kind of speech you employ in your relationship. So every behavioral pattern has what George Kelly used to call its range of convenience. So a set of events where it works well. When you choose a pattern to incorporate, you choose that new behavioral pattern, which will encompass all or most of those times or situations where you pull. And then you incorporate it. And then by analyzing it, you see where it actually performs well and where it doesn't. And then where it doesn't, you find ways to tweak it, improve it, or altogether just reject it and change it and add something else. This is one of the things that we do in therapy very often. In fact, I would say that that's most of therapy. And then it's something you can do on your own as well. But either you can download our app because it's free, so you can use it, or you can journal, or you can find a person to work with, and then through back and forth, you can clarify these things. And then there's always discipline. So I often struggle to explain to people how discipline is different than willpower, because in therapy, people often think, not everyone, obviously, but it is a common theme. So something that I hear daily. It's that somehow you need to have very strong will and that you just need to power through an urge. Willpower comes in handy from time to time. It is a useful resource to have, but it's a short-term resource. It's something that will work once or twice, but it is not something that you can base sustainable change on. Motivation also doesn't work very well in the long run because our motivation kind of fluctuates. So sometimes you will feel motivated and you will do well. Then, on other days, you will wake up and think, oh, I can't implement anything today, sorry. And then you're not going to do something. Or if you feel less motivated, you will procrastinate and so on. So motivation is good, it's necessary, but it really is not what will create a new behavioral pattern. Instead, it's discipline. So discipline means that you implement a certain set of behaviors because it aligns with your values, not necessarily because you feel like doing it. So I will talk about mindfulness in just a few minutes, but mindfulness is actually a very good example of this. The key to any change or to any benefit from mindfulness, other than kind of immediate relaxation, is regular practice. And regular practice means daily practice, at least once a day. And that means that there will be days when you will not want to meditate, and then you should. Zen Buddhists often like to say that if you cannot find the time to meditate 30 minutes, then you absolutely should meditate 60 minutes every day. And that's basically what discipline boils down to, which is that you do something and because it's the right thing to do, not because it gives you immediate gratification. It also teaches you patience, which is a good thing to have when it comes to psychological change. Like, to give you an example, so if you've been to any of my previous webinars, or those where we talked about mindfulness at least, you know that I've had my own practice for a long time. So for certainly over a decade, like 12, 13 years, maybe even. And there are some times when I really don't feel like doing it, but I really never skip a day. This whole week was like that. I was very tired in the morning and I really didn't feel like getting out of bed. And my morning meditation sessions are 45 minutes. So I have to wake up. If I have to wake up early, then I have to wake up really early so that I have time to meditate. And every day this week, so from the last 3 or 4 days, when I wake up, or rather when the alarm wakes me up, my first thought is, oh, do I really have to just get up now and meditate? Ugh. And when I have that thought, then I get up and I meditate. Not because I really want to, I really don't feel like doing it. And there's a lot of thoughts that are saying, just stay in bed. It's just so good. Just close your eyes for 5 more minutes. You know that. And then 5 more minutes, and then you wake up in 2 hours. But I see this thought as just like a distraction, like just this unnecessary thought that I'm having, because I'm doing this because it's something I do for my mental health. It gives me enormous pleasure. Over the years, I've seen so many rewards from my mindfulness practice. So overall, I know it makes me a better person. And then I get up and I sit on that cushion and then I meditate. So that's discipline. It doesn't involve being hard on yourself. So I actually have to be very nice to myself. Otherwise, I will go against myself if I'm not nice to myself. So I remind myself, about why I'm doing this. This is where discipline comes from. It doesn't come from a hard place. It doesn't come from a place of judgment or fear. It actually comes from this place where you want yourself to do better and be better. So that is maybe the most sustainable and most efficient way to drive your new habits. Because remember, neuroplasticity has to do with validation. You want those circuits to be validated, that means no fear. So one thing that you have to know, and this has to do with expectations that I mentioned in the beginning, is that this process is slow. So it unfolds over time, and that means that you have to give yourself time to change. And the way that it flows is also not linear. In over 10 years of working as a therapist, I have never in my life seen a person change completely in a linear fashion, just becoming better and better and better every day. If I saw that, I think I would ask this person to just kind of stab them with a needle, because I would believe that they're a robot, because humans just don't change that way. So we're very messy creatures. There's always like back and forth and failures and slip ups and relapses and all kinds of stuff. So we need time. Other than time, what we need is dedicated repetition. Because remember, neuroplasticity works based on reinforcement of certain synaptic or certain synapses. And in order for your brain to kind of keep them active, they need to be activated as often as possible. So when you do habit reversal training, if you're one of my clients, and I guess anyone's client in the program, you are told usually treat competing responses as new habits. So just practice them as much as you can, as often as you can, in those specific situations where you would sometimes pull, because it gives your brain time and the necessary repetition to implement, to kind of remember and really embody this as your natural new behavior. It does take a lot of effort. That would be my point. As Samuel Beckett said, fail again and then fail better. Once we fail, and that does always happen, the only thing that you can actually do is just make yourself feel better, see what you can do to minimize damage, then sit and think about what happened. Is it a new trigger? Is it a different trigger? Were you not mindful enough? And so on. So try to see what went wrong and then just find a productive, proactive strategy for next time. But there is no change without failure. It is simply not possible. You cannot even know what technique works for you unless you try some out and then fail at them. right? And then the one that you fail least with is the one to stick with. Also, when it comes to time and success, it is really important to remember what I said about progress not being linear. The way that it works is that in the beginning, once you start kind of reinforcing a new pattern, you're very likely to actually do good. You will remember to use it, you will feel motivated, you will apply it, and you might even surprise yourself with how fast you're progressing. But then you will hit a plateau. So there will be a period of time when you will be stable, but you won't be making any more rapid progress. And then there will be periods of decline as well. This sort of happens naturally. And then what you need to do is reinforce your intention. And the reason why this often happens is first because you're human, so it just kind of goes with us as fallible beings that we are. But the second reason is because people tend to stop reinforcing new patterns once they see results. This sounds counterintuitive, but it actually happens very, very often. I cannot tell you how many clients I've had who would start using a certain set of techniques, and then they would achieve certain results, like be very happy, see some hair growth, and then just stop using everything and then experience a relapse. So neuroplasticity and in general psychological change in a more wider context doesn't really work like taking Tylenol for a headache. So even if you're doing well, you have to practice. In fact, if you're doing well, then you should practice even more so that you do better. So that is very important to remember when you fail. So I'm going to show you two studies now. One that illustrates how functional neuroplasticity works, and then the other one that shows how structural neuroplasticity works. They both have certain, first of all, they both talk about mindfulness, and I have selected parts of the study here and in the other slides that will show you why this also might be actually a useful practice, not just an example of neuroplasticity. And you will notice maybe some similarities with how I describe the process of change. So this first study is from 3 years ago, and it studies the impact of mindfulness meditation training on how our amygdala react to emotional stimuli. So if you don't know what amygdala is, those are two little kind of just little blobs of gray matter that are located deep inside your brain. So there's subcortical structures. So in the white mass, you have the amygdala, and they belong to our limbic system, which means that they have to do with emotional processing. So when you're angry, when you're upset, frustrated, and all these usually negative emotions, your amygdala kind of light up. They're very, very active. So if you want to decrease negative emotion, or at least our reactions to negative emotions, what we want to see when we look at brain scans is lower activity of this specific region. So I wanted to tell you why amygdala is called amygdala, but then I realized that for whatever strange reason, my brain is short-circuiting now, and I know how to translate that word. It's a Greek word, obviously, in origin, into 3 different languages, but English is just not one of them. So you will remain without explanation. Okay, so here's how the study was done. They compared people who have been meditating for a very, very long time. So people who have over 9,000 hours of meditation, including intensive retreats. So very serious, dedicated meditators. And then people who completed a short-term MBSR course. So MBSR stands for mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it's a very good course that talks about stress management through mindfulness. And it's one of the best studied interventions that we have in psychology because it's well structured, lasts a reasonable amount of time, so it's easy to use for studies. It was invented by John Kabat-Zinn, who is also a great mindfulness teacher. So what they did was they took these people who don't have any experience with meditation and they tested them. They kind of shoved them into a scanner and showed them pictures. These pictures would be either emotionally neutral or positive or negative. And what they would do is they would leave it up to the subjects to determine whether or not these images elicit a positive, negative, or neutral reaction. And then they would give them self-assessment tests as well. So just to check with how they experience those images. Then, so they test them that way. Then they train them with MBSR. So in the next 2 months, they meditate every day. So MBSR is quite an intense program. So you're required to meditate, I think, at least 20 minutes a day. And then you have walking meditation and yoga and informal mindfulness, all kinds of stuff is in there. It's an intense course, but a very good one. And then after those 8 weeks, they measured what happened to these people, or rather they did the same test over again, and they tried to see if there are any results. And then obviously they did the same test with long-term meditators, and then they made comparisons. So the overall conclusion, and something that I like to repeat whenever I talk about mindfulness, is that long-term meditation practice leads to the most reduction in your amygdala. So that means the more you meditate, the less angry you'll get, right? You'll have more emotional control. So here's an interesting thing from this study. I'm not going to read this whole paragraph because I don't want to bore you. But basically what they say, this observing thoughts non-reactively, is just how you have to say meditation to be published. But what they meant to say is that people who meditate, all of them, have some reduced reactivity to emotionally charged content, even after 8 weeks. Obviously, the longer you do it, the stronger the effect. There were 2 sort of things that were found in this study that were very interesting. One is that in the beginning, so those newbie meditators, they actually had strengthened certain connections in the brain. That would be yet another example of functional neuroplasticity. Those would be connections between your amygdala and this elegant acronym here, VMPFC, which is ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So it's basically like the beginning of your eyebrows, and then that's where it starts and goes above your eye, that part of the brain, essentially. So the connection of that part of your brain to the amygdala. So why is this important? So it's important because long-term meditators didn't really have these connections. They were not any stronger with them, as you would expect. Like if you keep reinforcing something, it would make sense that these connections would become stronger and stronger, but they didn't. And why is that? If you remember, let me see if I can go back. Number 1 here, intention. Intention is something that you set consciously. So you decide that you're going to do something. And this kind of executive functioning is related to the prefrontal cortex. So in the beginning, having an intention to do something and being very clear about it is essential. But then as you practice more and more and more, this becomes less important because the whole process becomes almost your default way of functioning. That's exactly what I was saying about sort of having to fail, having to consciously analyze in the beginning, having to try harder, do differently. That's exactly what that is. So in the beginning stages, for functional neuroplasticity, this is very, very important. And there was another thing that was quite interesting, which is that they found that there is no difference in what they see in brain scans of long-term and short-term meditators in terms of how their brain reacts to negative stimuli. So they all feel those bad emotions, or rather their brains produce them equally. But on the self-reports, long-term meditators reported a lot more neutral images than the short-term meditators were, meaning that they weren't really shaken up to the extent by what they were feeling. And so this is what they say in relation to this. I will read this part because I think it's written decently well. The process strengthened by mindfulness meditation is not a specific decrease in reactivity to negative stimuli. So that means that it's not that you feel less. That is never the goal of meditation, right? So you feel the same or even more, I would say. Okay, so, but rather may impact emotional responding more generally, and is consistent with the view from contemplative traditions that this practice decreases stickiness, the power of emotions to linger and alter subsequent experience by reducing the propensity to avoid unpleasant and grasp at pleasant experiences. If you go back a few slides, remember how I started my explanation on how pooling becomes reinforced as a habit from running away from difficult experiences? There it is right there. So this is nicely summarized by someone named Hölzel. I may have butchered the name, I apologize. So non-reactivity leads to unlearning of previous connections and thereby to liberation from being bound to habitual emotional reactions. So basically what happens is that when you meditate for a very long time, you don't stop feeling, you don't become numb, none of these things. In fact, you feel equally or more. But what does happen is that you change the way you relate to your feelings. So you build a kind of stamina so they don't overwhelm you and they don't overpower you. You're able to kind of experience them and observe them at the same time. And the reason why I'm saying is that you sometimes feel even more. It's not because this study talks about this. This is, I guess, from my personal experience with meditation and also from sort of conversations I've had with other people who meditate over the years, is that I've noticed that I've become, I think, far more emotional than I was before I was actually meditating, or at least more aware of what I was feeling. But now even the negative emotions that I feel are quite intense, and the positive ones are quite intense. It's like, and these things that can make you feel good are also smaller, and it really adds richness to your emotional life. But because all these emotions are so clear, they don't become too much at any point. And this is, to me, the real magic of how meditation works. And all thanks to functional neuroplasticity. Because I assume, since I've been meditating for so long, I have a lot more than 9,000 hours behind me. I would assume that my amygdala is not particularly reactive at this point. Although I would like to check it like one day. Okay, so I already explained this part. It has to do with hours of practice and making it automatic so that you don't have to activate your prefrontal cortex every time. And this is a second study that I want to show you, which deals with structural neuroplasticity. This is, what I called magic. So it's called brief mindfulness meditation induces gray matter changes in a brain hub. According to these researchers, so when I say magic, I literally mean this. So this study says that only after 10 hours of meditation, that's extremely little. Like 10 hours of meditation is what I do per week. It's ridiculously little, apparently. So I'm going to read this part in blue. So only after 10 hours of meditating, increases were often detected in areas involving interoceptive awareness and self-regulation, such as ACC, that's anterior cingulate cortex. It's also part of the limbic system, so processes our emotions. Insular cortex, insular cortex is this hidden part of our cortex. You can't see it on the surface. You kind of have to move some parts of your brain to see it. But insula, that means island in Latin. What it does is that it's responsible for proprioception. So insula tells you what's happening in your body. I don't know if there are any more cars that could possibly pass by. Sorry. Okay, so insula tells you what's happening inside your body as it's happening, right? Prefrontal cortex, we already explained what that does, and sensory cortices, which obviously processes sensory information. And hippocampus, this is also important. So hippocampus has to do with memory. However, so this is where you get more gray matter. So they can actually visibly measure before and after and see that you've gained new neurons. Conversely, they say reduction in volume was often detected in the amygdala in meditation studies, suggesting that this subcortical structure associated with emotion and stress may manifest a different trend of structural plasticity and may underlie the behavioral reduction of stress reactivity commonly observed in meditators. So meditation actually protects you from stress, anxiety, and being overwhelmed by emotions by doing two different types of neuroplasticity, let's say. Some structures become bigger and some become smaller. So this tells you that this is not a random process, that if you tailor an activity very precisely, you can get very, very specific results. Now, when it comes to this study, since it's done only after 10 hours of meditation, we can't really know how permanent these changes are, because it's kind of like going to the gym. Like, you can go to the gym for a certain period of time and you will see changes, but if you stop going to the gym, you'll just go back to where you were before. But then if you go to the gym for a very, very long time, your body's structure will be reorganized so that even if you stop going to the gym, you will retain more or less the same shape. Likely, a similar process is involved here. There are researchers like Richie Davidson or Sarah Lazar who've done studies that support these changes, but in people who've meditated for much, much longer. So the longer you do it, the more structural changes you make. And one word when it comes to aging also. There was a study that was done somewhere in Germany, and I read it a long time ago, and I can't seem to find it anywhere on my hard drive, that tested people who've meditated for a very, very long time in monastic environments. So basically Tibetan monks and monks from Southeastern Asia. So they brought them all to Germany someplace and then took a look at what's happening with their brains as they meditate. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because some of them were elderly people, and their brains still had these changes. So mindfulness could be one practice, like learning other skills that might prevent cognitive decline in old age. So it might actually keep your brain young, so to speak, under quotation marks. So that's all I had for you for this evening. Now I'm going to close the poll and see what is it that we will be talking about in September, and then I will go to your questions. Let's see. Okay, so let me see what the winner is. After this update, Zoom doesn't automatically highlight the winner, so I have to scroll through all of it. Oh no, we have several topics that have apparently the exact same number of votes. Let me see if I can relaunch the poll. Oh no. Okay, so let me read it, what the topics might be for next week. So different types of psychotherapeutic treatments, which ones are more effective and how they work. Then self-image and hair pulling, and changing and healing, goals and expectations.